Lincoln's Web Fleet, between April of 1861 and the end of the Civil War, 134,000 men served in the navies of both the North and the South. This compares to the 3.5 million men who served in the armies of the North and the South. And when people think navies in the Civil War, well, they think, well, the only naval actions that happened was the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the Alabama and the Kearsarge, or maybe the Battle of Mobile Bay, where Admiral Farragut stood in the rigging and was tied in the rigging and said, "Damn the torpedoes," and full speed ahead. That's all people think it happened that involved the Navy. Well, in reality, there was a big discussion that happened right at the beginning of the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln sat down with his military leaders and advisors, and he said, what would be the most effective way to subdue the South? And General, mind you, Winfield Scott, who was considered the wisest military leader in the land, said, simple. We close off all the southern ports, we shut down the Mississippi River, and we don't let anything in, we don't let anything out, and we strangle the South, and that will bring them to their knees because they don't have the ability to support themselves with anything other than their cotton. And he said, it'll take a while, but I guarantee that they will come around and realize that they don't stand a chance. Well, all the hotheads said, no, that's not going to happen because there's no glory in standing back and just waiting. So what does Lincoln do? He calls up 75,000 volunteers to go put down the rebellion, and the Army goes off and marches down, and we ended up with Bull Run and all kinds of other things, and we end up with the land war. But Scott's plan becomes known as the Anaconda Plan. And eventually what happens and what ends up subduing the South in reality becomes the Anaconda Plan. Come to my class and we'll see how that happens. We'll learn that the very first shot fired by the Union, not the Confederacy now, because we know that the first shots fired by the Confederacy were at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. However, the first Union shot fired in anger was by the USS Harriet Lane, again in defense of Fort Sumter, as she attempted to relieve the garrison at Fort Sumter and bring in supplies. We'll learn that the last blockade running port, the fall, was Wilmington, Delaware, or Wilmington, North Carolina, and that happened after the fall of Fort Fisher in 1865. Again, a major naval battle. The largest shipbuilding city in the South, New Orleans. The South, all of its leaders being Army trained, most of them West Point graduates, thought that a U.S. Army Major General by the name of Ulysses S. Grant was going to march down from Tennessee and capture New Orleans. So they decided to send all their land forces and defenses up to this little place called Shiloh and stop him. Well, what happens? A Commodore by the name of Farragut steams up the Mississippi River, steams past two forts that are sitting about 70 miles down the Mississippi from New Orleans, like they weren't sitting there, pulls up to New Orleans where there's no defenses and says, "Good morning, city, I'm here." The only people who were there to defend it was a whole bunch of old ladies who literally threw potatoes at the Marines that he landed when they went to the customs house to run up the flag. And they threatened to lynch him. Vicksburg, a joint operations between the United States Navy and the United States Army, sealed the Mississippi from the Confederacy. Again, going back to the Anaconda Plan, cutting off the east from the west. We'll talk about submarines, or not submarines, but we'll talk about the very first ironclad that was built was not the Monitor or the Alabama or the Virginia, but it was Louisiana, built to defend the New Orleans. She was down at those two forts we talked about that Commodore Farragut ran past like they weren't sitting there, and it was captured. We'll talk about the first Union. We'll talk about the first Union. The first Union ironclad that was built 6 months before the Monitor, the USS Cairo, that was built on the western rivers to help secure the rivers for the Union. We'll talk about submarines. The Hunley, the USS Alligator. Yes, the Union had submarines as well. And we'll talk about the men that served in the Civil War. And we'll talk about this guy, who was actually the first United States Navy SEAL, or Special Operations guy. Come to my class and we'll talk about these and more.